They didn't just tear down my orchard. They erased 40 years of my family like it was a smudge on a blueprint. And the worst part is, they thought I wouldn't even notice until it was too late. But what they didn't realize, not for 1 second, is that I knew something about their project they'd already forgotten. I remember the smell before anything else, which sounds strange, I know, but it hit me the second I stepped out of the truck that afternoon, sweet, heavy, almost fermented, like fruit left too long in the sun. Except this wasn't late harvest. This was wrong. This was decay where there shouldn't have been any. I walked a little faster, boots crunching gravel, heart doing that quiet, steady climb it does when something in your gut starts whispering that things aren't right. And by the time I reached the bend in the road where the orchard should have opened up like it always did, green and alive and familiar, there was nothing. Not nothing like empty land. No, nothing like aftermath. Tree stumps jagged and raw, sticking out of the dirt like broken teeth. Mangoes split open and crushed into the soil, guavas smeared into mud under wide tire tracks that didn't belong there. The irrigation lines were torn up, dangling like veins cut loose. It wasn't harvesting, it wasn't pruning, it was clean, deliberate destruction. I just stood there for a minute, maybe longer, I don't know, trying to match what I was seeing with what I knew should have been there, like my brain needed time to catch up to reality. Because that orchard, that wasn't just land. My grandfather, Walter Keene, planted the first trees back when this stretch of road wasn't even properly paved yet, when trucks kicked up dust instead of humming over asphalt. He used to say the trees would outlive him, and he was right, until they didn't. My dad turned that orchard into a roadside stand, just a wooden cart and a hand-painted sign, selling fruit to long-haul drivers and families passing through, calling out prices with a voice that carried farther than seemed possible. And me? I grew up in those trees. I knew which branches bent just enough to climb, which fruits ripened early, which seasons tasted sweeter than others. Summer wasn't a date on a calendar. It was the first bite of a mango that dripped down your wrist. So yeah, standing there, looking at what was left, it didn't feel like someone had cleared land. It felt like someone had reached into my life and pulled something out by the roots. Hey, a voice called out behind me, sharp, practiced, the kind of voice that belongs to someone used to being listened to. I turned and saw a man in a clean button-down shirt, holding a clipboard like it was part of his body. He walked up carefully, like he didn't want to dirty his shoes. "You the owner here?" he asked. I looked at him for a second before answering. He glanced at the ground, then back at me, not uncomfortable, not apologetic, just efficient. "Site clearance," he said, like that explained everything. "Future frontage expansion tied to the Ridgeline commercial complex." He gestured vaguely across the road, and that's when I looked past him and really saw it. Glass and steel rising where open land used to be. A shopping complex so big it looked like it had dropped out of another world and landed here by mistake. Bright banners stretched across the front, promising premium retail experience, easy highway access, modern convenience, all the words people like him liked to use when they meant money. "You didn't call?" I said, keeping my voice steady, because anger doesn't help when you don't understand the full picture yet. He checked something on his clipboard. Not required. The vegetation fell within redevelopment parameters. Non-structural, non-protected. Non-protected, I repeated, tasting the words like something sour. Organic elements, he added, almost helpfully. They tend to reduce visual appeal for commercial frontage. I actually laughed at that, just once, short and sharp, because the alternative was doing something I couldn't take back. "You mean trees?" He didn't respond to that, just made a note, nodded to himself, and walked back toward the road like this was already finished, already decided, already forgotten. I stayed there until the sun started dropping low enough to stretch shadows across the torn-up ground. And that's when the quiet set in, no bees, no rustling leaves, no distant chatter from people stopping by for fruit. Just the faint hum of traffic and the distant noise of construction across the road. That's when something clicked. Not anger, not yet, something quieter. Memory. A few years back, before all that steel started climbing into the sky, there'd been talk in town about permits, zoning, environmental reviews, people arguing at council meetings, developers pushing, locals pushing back. My dad used to follow that stuff more than I did. Said if you own land, you better understand the paper that governs it, because paper outlasts people. And I remembered him saying something specific, Something about buffer zones. I didn't move right away, just stood there with that thought turning over in my head, slow at first, then faster, because if I was remembering it right, that complex across the road didn't just get approved because someone signed off on it. It got approved with conditions. And if those conditions weren't met anymore, well, that changes things. I turned back toward my truck, took one last look at what used to be the orchard, and for the first time since I got there, I wasn't just seeing what I'd lost. I was starting to see what they'd done wrong. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was angry, at least not in the way you'd expect. It was more like my mind refused to settle, like it had grabbed onto a loose thread and wouldn't let go. I kept seeing my dad sitting at that old kitchen table, the one with the burn mark in the corner from a coffee pot accident back in the 90s, flipping through folders and papers like they actually mattered more than the land itself. And I remember once asking him why he bothered keeping all that stuff. And he just looked at me and said, because one day, someone with more money than you is going to try to tell you what your land means. And paper is the only language they respect. At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. Turns out he was just early. Around midnight, I got up, walked out to the shed behind the house, and dug through a rusted metal toolbox that hadn't been opened in years. Took me a while, hands getting dusty, flipping past old receipts, faded maps, even a couple of photos I didn't expect to see again, and then I found it. Folded, worn at the edges, but still intact, the zoning clearance file tied to the Ridgeline project, back when it was just a proposal and not a skyline. I spread it out on the workbench under a flickering bulb, leaned in, and started reading like my life depended on it, because in a way, it did. And there it was, buried halfway through a section most people probably skipped over, written in that careful legal language designed to sound boring enough that no one questions it. Maintenance of designated green buffer zones along adjacent agricultural land is required to preserve environmental compliance and visual integration with existing rural landscape. I actually said it out loud, just to hear it. Green buffer zones. And then I looked at the attached map. My orchard wasn't just nearby. It was labeled, marked, counted as part of their compliance strategy. Not decoration. Not optional. Required. I leaned back, let out a slow breath. And for the first time since I saw those stumps, I felt something shift inside me. Not relief, not yet, but direction. Because suddenly this wasn't just about what they took. It was about what they broke. The next morning I cleaned up, put on a button-down I hadn't worn in years, grabbed every piece of documentation I could find, and drove into town. The municipal planning office sat in one of those older buildings that always smells faintly like paper and air conditioning. Like time moves a little slower inside. I walked up to the front desk, laid everything down, and said, I think there's a problem with the Ridgeline project. The clerk barely looked up at first, probably used to complaints that didn't go anywhere. You'll have to be more specific, she said. So I was. I walked her through it, step by step, not raising my voice, not rushing, just laying it out the way my dad would have. The original conditions, the buffer zone requirement, the demolition, the lack of notice. And somewhere in the middle of it, I saw her expression change. Not dramatically, just enough. Do you have documentation of the site condition? She asked. I slid the photos across the counter. She looked at them longer than I expected, then picked up the file again, flipping to the section I'd marked. Give me a moment, she said, and disappeared into the back. That moment turned into about 20 minutes, and when she came back, she wasn't alone. Two other people, one older, one younger, both with that same look people get when something routine suddenly isn't. We're going to need to review this, the older one said. You should, I replied. By the end of that week, inspectors were out on site. Real ones, not guys with clipboards trying to justify a decision that had already been made. They measured distances, compared soil lines, referenced original plans against what was actually there now. And the more they checked, the quieter the construction site across the road got. I drove by one afternoon and noticed something strange, fewer machines running, fewer workers moving around. The usual noise had dropped to a kind of uneasy hum, like everyone was waiting for something. Turns out they were. The suspension order hit 2 days later. Temporary, at least on paper, but effective immediately. No new shop allocations. No occupancy certifications. No forward progress until environmental compliance could be reassessed and restored. And just like that, momentum stopped. You don't really understand how fragile something like that project is until you see it pause. From the outside, it looks unstoppable, all glass and steel and confidence. But inside, it runs on agreements, timelines, investor trust. Pull one thread, and the whole thing starts to tighten. Word got around faster than I expected. Small town, news doesn't stay quiet long. I started hearing things at the gas station, at the diner, even from folks who never paid much attention to that development before. Something's off over there, one guy said while pouring coffee. Heard permits got flagged, another added. I didn't say much, just listened. A week in, the ripple effects were obvious. Advertising slowed down. Those big banners that used to flap like declarations of victory, some of them disappeared. I heard anchor tenants were delaying lease agreements, not canceling yet, just waiting, which in business is sometimes worse. I drove past the complex again one evening, just as the sun was setting, and it looked different. Same structure, same scale, but without motion, without noise. It felt hollow, like a shell waiting to see if it still had a future. Workers stood around instead of working. Ladders leaned against unfinished storefronts with no one climbing them. Security guards lingered by locked glass doors that weren't supposed to be locked yet. And I'll admit something here, because I'm not going to pretend I'm above it. Part of me felt satisfied. Not because I wanted people to lose jobs, not because I enjoy watching things fall apart, but because for the first time since they bulldozed that orchard, it felt like the scale had shifted, just a little. Like maybe I wasn't the only one dealing with consequences anymore. About 2 weeks after the suspension, I got a knock on my door. I already knew who it was before I opened it. Different man this time. Older, sharper, dressed better, the kind of person who doesn't usually show up without a reason. He introduced himself as Daniel Hargrove, project director for Ridgeline. No clipboard, no rehearsed calm, just tension, held tight behind a polite expression. "Mr. Keene," he said, "I think we need to talk." I stepped aside, let him in, and gestured toward the same kitchen table my dad used to sit at. Funny how things circle back like that. He didn't waste time. "We've reviewed the situation," he said, choosing his words carefully. "There appears to have been an oversight during the site clearance phase." "An oversight?" I repeated, leaning back in my chair. "Yes, and we're prepared to address it." I didn't answer right away. Just let the silence sit there a second longer than he probably liked. "Go on," I said. "We're willing to replant," he continued. "Mature trees, expedited growth systems, irrigation upgrades. We'll restore the visual and environmental elements required for compliance. Additionally, we're prepared to offer financial compensation for your loss." There it was. The fix. Clean. Efficient. Transactional. Like what happened could be balanced out with the right combination of landscaping and a check. I looked at him for a long moment, then leaned forward slightly. "You're not here because you feel bad," I said. "You're here because your project is frozen." His jaw tightened, just a fraction. "We're here to resolve the issue." I nodded slowly. "Good," I said, because at that point, I already knew this conversation wasn't going to go the way he expected. I let that word hang there for a second, resolve, like it was something simple, something clean, something you could just wrap up with a signature and a handshake. And I could see in his eyes that he expected this to be a negotiation, the kind he was used to, where numbers get thrown around, maybe a few apologies, and eventually both sides walk away thinking they got a decent deal. But the thing is, this was never about a deal. Not for me. I leaned forward, rested my arms on the table, and looked at him the same way my dad used to look at people when they tried to talk around something instead of through it. "You didn't just remove trees," I said, calm, steady. "You removed the condition that keeps your entire project legal." He didn't interrupt. That told me he already knew. "You built your approval on that buffer zone," I continued, tapping the old file lightly. "You needed it there so everything else could exist. And now it's gone, because you decided it didn't matter. We've acknowledged the error," he said, voice tightening just a bit. "And we're offering a solution." I nodded once slow. "You're offering a patch." That landed. I saw it in the way his posture shifted, just slightly. "Let me be clear," I went on, "because I don't think anyone's been clear with you yet. I'm not interested in replacing what you destroyed with something that looks good in a report. I want it restored the way it was supposed to exist in the first place." "And what does that look like to you?" he asked, a little sharper now, a little less polished. There it was, the real tone, finally. I sat back, took a breath, and laid it out, piece by piece. "Full ecological restoration," I said. "Native species. Not imported, not fast-growth substitutes, not decorative landscaping. The same kind of trees that were there before, planted with the same spacing, the same density, the same relationship to the land. He opened his mouth, probably to argue cost or timeline, but I didn't give him the space. And not just planting, I added. Maintenance. Long-term. Soil recovery where you tore it up. Water systems that actually support growth, not just appearance. I want it functioning, not staged. That's a significant undertaking, he said. So is losing your zoning compliance? I replied. That one hit harder. He didn't respond right away. And there's one more thing, I said, before he could regain control of the conversation. His eyes narrowed just slightly. Of course there is. I almost smiled at that. Almost. You want your frontage back? I asked. The clean, accessible, premium appeal you were so concerned about? He didn't answer, but he didn't have to. You pay for it, I said. Permanent frontage compensation, not a one-time check. Ongoing. As long as that complex benefits from being next to this land, you compensate the land that makes it possible. That's when the silence really settled in. Not uncomfortable, heavy. Because now it wasn't about fixing a mistake. Now it was about acknowledging dependency. He leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and for the first time since he walked in, he looked tired. Not defeated, not yet, but aware of the position he was in. That sets a precedent, he said carefully. I shrugged. So does bulldozing someone's livelihood without a phone call. We sat there for a while after that, neither of us rushing it, and I could almost see the calculations running behind his eyes. Cost versus delay, optics versus control, short-term loss versus long-term risk. Because by that point, this wasn't just between me and him anymore. The inspectors were involved. The paperwork was flagged. People were asking questions. And modern developments, they don't like questions. Finally, he nodded once. Small, but decisive. We'll agree to your terms, he said. Just like that. No dramatic pause. No last-minute pushback. Because he knew, the same way I did, that the alternative wasn't negotiation, it was collapse, slow and public. We shook hands, and his grip was firm, but it didn't carry the same confidence it might have a few weeks earlier. Then he stood, thanked me in that formal way people do when they're already halfway out the door mentally, and left. I didn't follow him out. I just sat there for a minute, listening to the quiet of the house, the same quiet that used to be filled with my dad flipping through papers or muttering about permits and property lines, and I realized something I hadn't expected. I didn't feel like I'd won. Not in the way people think about winning, anyway. Because nothing about that orchard coming down was undone. Those original trees, the ones my grandfather planted, the ones my dad built his life around, they were gone. What I'd secured wasn't a return to what was. It was a correction to what shouldn't have happened. And maybe that's the best you get sometimes. A few months later, the land started to change again. Slow at first. Equipment coming in, but not the kind that destroys, the kind that prepares. Soil being turned carefully, irrigation lines laid with precision instead of ripped out. Then the trees, not saplings you could ignore, but mature plantings, brought in with root systems intact, set into the ground with a kind of attention that felt almost respectful. I walked the property one morning while the crews were working, and one of the guys, hands covered in dirt, nodded at me and said, "We're doing this one right." I nodded back. "Yeah," I said. "You are." Across the road, the complex came back to life too. Permits reinstated, construction resumed, lights back on, banners back up, like nothing had ever happened, at least to anyone who didn't know where to look. But I did. Every time I drove past, I could see both sides of it. The polished glass, reflecting sunlight like a promise, and the line of trees beside it, quiet, grounded, necessary. One doesn't exist the same way without the other. And that's the part they almost forgot. Now here's where it gets interesting, because not everyone sees it the way I do. Some folks around town think I went too far, that I should have taken the money and let it go, that slowing down a project that size affected more people than just the ones who made the decision. Others think I didn't go far enough, that I should have pushed until the whole thing collapsed, made an example out of it. Me? I think there's a difference between revenge and balance, but I'll be honest, that line isn't always as clear as people like to pretend. So I'm curious what you think. If you were in my place, would you have done the same thing? Pushed back the way I did? Or would you have handled it differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read more of them than you'd probably expect. And if stories like this, real situations, real consequences, the kind that don't come with easy answers, if that's your kind of thing, go ahead and subscribe, stick around. Because this wasn't the last time someone thought land was just land.